for joining us here today to discuss the book of Everlasting Things with Aanchal Malhotra. Now, I'm sure some of you would have already picked the book and read it, but those of you who haven't, we'll try not to share any spoilers and really hope that you'll be grabbing your copy after the session. So, the book of Everlasting Things, it's not a partition novel. It's also not a love story. It's a book about love, which is set against the backdrop of partition. But what it is really, it's a novel about family. And it spans roughly around 100 years, right? So, Achal, I want to know from you that as an oral historian with two acclaimed non-fiction books, what prompted you to shift gears and try your hand at historical fiction?
That's a great question, and I think a novel is very difficult to write. If I would now, having done both genres, having started as an oral historian, moved into fiction, I would say non-fiction is much easier for me. But there are certain things that each of the genres offer you that the other doesn't. Um, and I think for me, the intention of writing one or the other is different. When I was doing my field work with Partition, um, I kept, you see, the diversity of narratives becomes quite apparent to you. And as you record story after story after story, and they are all different in the details that they give, you start to think about maybe characters that you have imagined that could also live in this world. And I think I wanted to see whether fiction was not just generous enough, but also expansive enough for me to take a historical time period, insert fictional characters into it, and see if they would settle, if they would be absorbed into it. I think also it is rare for a historian to write fiction about the same genre, about the same time period where they write history. So I knew Partition like the back of my hand, right? I knew that world. I knew the depth of its feeling. I knew the texture, and it helped a lot to write it. But as you said very rightly, this is not a partition novel. It has so many other landscapes in it. I think I started writing the novel in 2017, March, when my first book, Remnants, hadn't even come out. So it took me many years to work on it. And I think this is good because, Priyag was also saying it took him 7 years to write the novel. I think you really get to spend time with your characters. And I don't know if there's any difference between like the real people that I interviewed and the characters in my novel because you spend equal amount of time and equal amount of respect to both of us. I think I'm digressing.
But I have a follow up question to that. So, when you say that you pay an equal amount of respect to the personal records versus the fictional accounts and the fictional people and the stories that you create, but do you feel that when you're faithfully recording the narrative of a person who's lived through that event, you don't have any control over their narrative? You have to bear the responsibility to be faithful to that particular version. But when you're writing fiction, you exercise a great deal of creative authority and liberty. And you do have control over how that character would end up, what their life would look like. So was it something you actively exercised, or did the characters take on a life of their own?
Yeah, I think you can't help but let the character take the life of its own because you may have an idea of how the character arc is going to develop, but how much autonomy and agency the character demands in a certain chapter or a certain point in their lives is unpredictable at the beginning. For me, this novel also meant I had to trace two characters' lives from birth to death, which is a really long time because it's not just the big things in life, but also the everydayness of someone's life that you have to fill in. And there was no way I could have predicted, like one of the main characters, Firdaus, she was never going to be such an important character in the novel. She was always going to be a secondary character. But as I began writing, she demanded more paid space and she demanded more autonomy in a way that I was fully unprepared for, because I was used to dealing with, as you said, real people and their real stories and their interpretation of their lives.
So, as you said, you started writing Book of Everlasting Things in 2017, which was much before Remnants or In the Language of Remembering came out, which means you were simultaneously working with both the genres, and as you said, both of them require a very different approach. So, how did you manage those expectations of the genre one? And the second would be, did either genre also inform how you would receive or how you would approach the same event in a different context?
I don't think I could have written fiction without having written nonfiction. That would have been impossible, because nonfiction gave me the grounding, kind of the earth below your feet, and fiction was like the trees. It helped it to grow. I think because I was so immersed in the world of partition for such a long time, I mean, the other big landscape in the book is World War One, which I spent a lot of time researching as well. I think I became so obsessed with the landscapes of these worlds that you can predict the things that would happen, that would be easier to insert fictional characters into that direction. They have to inform each other. When I was working on In the Language and the Book of Everlasting Things really at the same time, writing a draft of one, editing a draft of the other, writing. I think that also gave respite, because you're kind of using different parts of your brain for it. You know, there is I don't want to say that creative nonfiction is analytical per se, but it is far more analytical than the freedom that comes with fiction. And particularly oral history, because you are following your interview, which is kind of like it's like a guideline for you. You know what is going to happen because you have lived that already. Um, I think when I was working on the novel, this was what I was really lacking, and it was not like the big stuff. It was not like the historical events and the timeline. No, it was really stupid stuff that you take for granted when you do any kind of field work. Like, what accent is the character speaking in? What are the colors of the wall? What does the home look like? Um, what time do they wake up? What do they eat? Little things like this that I wanted to be really accurate to the time, which is to say either the late 1800s, early 1900s, which when you speak to real people are things that they tell you, right? And when you listen to them, when you look at them, there are things that you observe and note. So it was these things that were really difficult for me to do justice to. And I think I am somebody that wants a historical novel to be as authentic. So if you're reading a newspaper, the newspaper has to exist, you know?
As you rightly said, Arjun, it's the research which also gives your story that malleability, your characters to be inserted in it. And another trope or another theme which requires that malleability is memory. And I want to discuss in detail the nature of memory in this particular novel. We have memory that is borrowed, memory that is inherited. We have subconscious memory, consciously suppressed memory, memory that is born over time, and then we have history. How do you navigate these different layers and juxtapose it with the historical accounts? And how did you decide who will become the custodian of whose memory and whose burden will it ultimately be to carry?
Those are really good questions. Some things in fiction are intuitive, they have to be. Not every decision can or should be explained, because some things come naturally. And I have regularly uh, dealt with memory. As you said, the keeping of it, the hiding of it, the discovery of it. It was very clear to me from the beginning the keepers of memory have to be the youngest in the family. Because that is how it is in real life as well. When you look at partition, when you look at narratives of the First and Second World War, who are the people who are recording those narratives? They're usually the third or fourth generation of that family that have time and distance from the event to look at it not objectively, but with enough information, enough emotional sensibility, a distance, of course, to be able to record it with love. And so I knew from the beginning that Anup and Samir were going to be not only the people who held on to memory, but also the people who discovered memory. Memory is a very difficult thing to be the keeper of because you see, you have to make certain decisions. Like, for instance, in my family, I'm very much the keeper of memory and things and dates and all that stuff. But I wonder how it makes my other siblings or cousins feel. You know, you are a receptacle for something as well because you have to take care of that thing. The fact that Samir, the perfumer, also discovered a big secret about his ancestor at a very unlikely time in his life was key to his own journey. He had to find something that would fracture the normalness of his life or the normalness that he had tried to create. These things were clear from the beginning, you know. So I don't know if I can explain certain decisions, but I think working with memory allows you to be quite agile with it. It's really weird because it's like a tool, right?
Subversive one at that.
Yes, yes. But when you see how memory works in different generations, then you are able to use it quite naturally. And I think it's only because I had spent time with various generations and their withholding or offering of memory at very key times to very key people. Because it matters who tells the story. And it matters who keeps the story. And they're not always the same person.
And that leads me to my next question, which is about the politics of remembering and forgetting. And it ostensibly manifests in the letters that Vivek writes to his father Somnath from the battlefield, where he writes, "The stories of our Sipahis will disappear into history, buried like the many bodies in the unknown land. But history must remember that we were here too." Now, this "we were here too" uh, is a statement which is also inserting them into the timeline of history, but also a personal narrative which might challenge the historical records which might have perpetuated further. Now, I want to know, how do you deal with the dichotomy between the personal records, like this one, the letters, and the historical accounts of the same event? Because they do give multiple versions of the same reality. So, how did the narrative contain that reality? Because it does it beautifully.
With any kind of colonial record keeping, you will always have two versions. I think this is why I find it really funny that when people talk about oral history, they talk about the veracity of that account. Well, how do you know if someone is telling the truth? How can you trust memory? And I always say that when you go into an archive and you sit and you look at something, you trust it because it's written down. But it is also one version. And in my case, for my subject, it is a colonial version. So that's also one. Well, how can you trust that? When you deal with colonial records, as I was when writing Vivek's sections about the war, the thing you have to understand about letters written from the front, under, the crown by Indians is that they wrote them in their regional languages. And not everyone could write them because not everyone was literate. So they would say them, they would narrate them to scribes, जिनको उर्दू में कातिब कहते हैं. So Vivek was a katib, and he would write these letters in whatever language, and then the British censor mail would take them, they would read them, they would translate them into English, they would cut out what cannot go from that letter, whether that was giving away too much of where they were or anti-British sentiment. And then they would send off these letters. And how we have these letters is because we have the translated archive. So it is so many steps removed from the actual texture of feeling. And the fact then that it doesn't exist in public memory at all. When I started learning about the war, I didn't know that there were 1.5 million Indian soldiers that served for England. That's a lot. And that's just one colony. The French had their own, obviously, the English had several others. And what were these people doing? At some point, they were cannon fodder. So Vivek goes to war thinking that when he gets on the ship at Karachi, he doesn't know where he's going. उसको कहा है कि विलायत जा रहे हैं. तो ये विलायत क्या है जहाँ फिरंगी अफसर रहते हैं. He doesn't know that it's France or it's Mesopotamia or it's England or whatever it is. He doesn't know. He gets off eventually in Egypt and he sees these incredible pyramids. And what are these people writing from the ship? Many of them have never seen water. Many of them have never ventured outside of the Punjab. So they're writing, I saw fish flying in the water, things like that. When they eventually get to their final destination, that is France, they're writing things about the women. Women are working. They're writing things about pets working in the field, whether that's cows or horses. They're writing about how fine this foreign land is. They're writing about the difference between the Englishmen and the Frenchmen, and how the French are free, and how we wish we would be one day too. They're writing about things like where you're offering namaz, or how many people in the camp, or what are you eating, or the fact that women are telling the Sikh soldiers that you've spent so much time on the ship and your hair has grown so long, let us trim it for you. But little do they know that they're not allowed to trim their hair. And the texture of feeling of these initial letters before war is very different than the letters at war. Vivek writes, we were here too, because he has seen battle and he has seen what will become of him, because he's fully unprepared for it. He doesn't come from a martial family. There's absolutely no logical sense for Vivek to join the army, except he thinks कि वो दुनिया देखेगा, right? He has a sense of adventure, which is how the war was. The enlistment for the First World War was also like join the war and see the world. Those were what the posters said, right? So I feel like these letters, they bear witness to the vacuums of popular history, archival history, colonial history. It is only in 2014, at the centenary of the war, that we understood the impact that India had on British victories. And I think if you ask an ordinary child in school, he will not know that Indians were in the First World War. So I think that fiction is also a way for us to, educate people a little bit in a way that doesn't seem too pedantic,
To come back to a little lighter topic, relatively, I'm curious to know, why did you choose these two particularly delicate art forms, perfumery and calligraphy? And both of them are reminiscent of a lost time. And what kind of research went into bringing these to life and bringing that texture, that flavor, that nuance to readers?
Well, Firdaus is she's not exactly a calligrapher, she's an illuminator. Nakashi jo karta hai. And she works with paper, she works with ink, she works with dyes. And to be quite frank, that was a very selfish choice because I trained as a printmaker and I used to make paper and I used to make dyes and, work with text and image. And I really missed the tactile feeling of that world. So I knew that Firdaus would do something that would allow me to return to that studio space. Um, with Sameer and the fact that he was a perfumer, I knew nothing about perfumery before I started research for this book. I don't even think I had a very good nose, but the more you smell, the better you smell. And your nose starts to become quite succinct at recognizing things. But the reason why I started thinking about perfumery at all was several years ago, my mother told me a story about her father, where my grandfather used to work for Dabur as a chemist, and he dabbled in amateur perfumery, and he would, for Dabur make soaps and body scrubs and all that stuff, and he would receive little vials of essence, floral essence, or papaya, or apple. There were weird things like Rambo and Star Sun. There were all these strange names, and there was rose and aloe and all that stuff. And so whatever he didn't use, he would bring home. And in the summertime, the cooler would be on. घास वाला cooler होता है, and he would deposit the essence in the water. So one day when the cooler goes on, the water is smelling of rose and the whole house is smelling of rose. The next day it's smelling of papaya. The third day it's smelling of whatever Rambo smells of. But this sense that someone went out of their way to create a perfumed environment for their family to live in, it really struck me. And also the fact that I didn't know my grandfather like that. I knew him as quite a strict person who had a lot of rules. And so for him to be so amorous and so gentle, it was really like a precious discovery. And I wanted Sameer's family to work on this craft that is dying now in India. I think UP is one of those few. UP Hyderabad is one of those few places where the craft is still as as robust as it once was. Kannauj is like perfumery of India, and I don't know. I wanted both these crafts that are, as you rightly said, dying. I wanted them to get their due, and I also wanted the novel to be dictated by the senses. I really think that the senses are characters in this novel. If you allow something like smell to really influence how you feel, then it can be considered a character. Yeah. I did for research, as you asked. I shadowed a perfumer for about 5 years across India and France, and spent a lot of time in Kannauj, where even the drains are fragrant.
And it's not just primarily these two art forms, but also textiles. The way you describe textures in the book is comparable to how, like, the justice is done to the smells, or the way
It's very kind of you. Thank you.
That's true. And even with calligraphy, and as the book said, these art forms are art of exactitude. And while like it was a really sensuous journey when you read the book and get to experience all of these little nuances, and I'm sure it must have come to you, as you just explained, a lot of research, which leads me to my next question. When you read any book set against the backdrop of partition or talks about partition, you would expect violence. Violence to be an active topic. But here you see, Aanchal, you very skillfully circled around violence. And was that a conscious choice, or was it just something you did not want to, base the story on completely, and wanted to shift the focus on the more humane side of the narrative?
Web is conscious for the reason that there is really no more need to discuss violence than is necessary. When you write about partition, for that matter, when you write about war, I mean, I've written about war without actually writing about the violence of war. But partition specifically, because that's a landscape that we here are quite familiar with. Even when I say the word partition, the image that comes to your mind is of the trains, is of the bodies, is of piles and piles of corpses. We know it. This language is we share it. We share it without knowing that we share it. So in a oral history interview, when an older lady says to me, yes, this is how it was happening. We were going in a kafila and then we got attacked, but I don't want to talk about it. But you can imagine it, right? You can, why does she think that I already know? Because we already share this popular language of violence of a particular event. There is no need to spend any more paid space on that violence. We are already doing a great disservice to the event by thinking about it only in the binary of good and bad. So the fact that there is violence will always be, it's it's in the background. The violence is the background of the time period. There's no escaping it. What happened in the foreground? How are people resisting it? How are people succumbing to it? How are people adding to it? How are they fueling it, or how are they diminishing themselves as a result of it? Is what is interesting and is what is human as well. So I think I've spent enough time thinking and talking about violence in my nonfiction to not let it become a primary character in my fiction.
Thank you so much, Aanchal. And on that note, we'd like to open it up to the audience members for any questions. Yeah, over there, please. So, I haven't read the book of Everlasting Peace. I've read your book on partition, the remnants, and I'm really curious to know, like when you do your research, when you write, could you just talk a little bit about your process? How do you go about it? And do you like kind of end up with, obviously end up with mountains of stuff, and how do you kind of sit?
Hmm. Um, the process is different for both fiction and nonfiction for me. I guess when I write nonfiction, my primary focus is the collection of interviews, which will determine what the book will look like. I don't know when I start a book of oral history what its heart will be. So, collecting the interviews, transcribing them, translating them from various languages to English, doing secondary research on specific things, and then looking at how you're going to structure the book. With fiction, it's a little bit different. I am a plotter, Tyag was talking about that. And I think I need to be because personally, as an individual, I'm very neat. And I think if my brain is messy, there's no creativity. Many people can create brilliance out of a mess. I'm not one of those people. I need to know exactly, well, maybe not exactly, but I need to know the skeleton of what I'm working with. So usually, for this novel at least, I wrote a skeletal story, and then I started to do field work because that's the only way I really know how to collect information. So I started interviewing perfumers. I started interviewing calligraphers. Very hard to find, by the way. I started interviewing men who had served in World War II and whose fathers and grandfathers had served in World War One. And after that, these are really the three main focuses of the book. I transcribed them and then I started supplementing with secondary research. I think, though, once you start to create at least historical fiction, things come to you. I don't know how it is for other novelists, but when I was in the world of the book, I, I found it very difficult to come out of it. And I would dream in the world of the book, and I would dream in the world of Samir and Firdaus and Vivek and Zainab and Altaf, and it was very seamless for me because I had embroiled myself in that world. So I don't know. It became a very immersive process, but I think I'm like that with nonfiction also. I'm quite obsessive. I don't have any other life. None.
Any other questions? Hi, Ajay. So my question is very simple, but yeah, it's something I'm struggling with in my writing currently. You like in everlasting things, you talk about the mundane and the everyday against the partition. Whereas it's already been established that during the partition there was a rupture in language, and the silences that came up. In that case, how do you have alternatives for language? How do you fill that gap when you're writing a work of fiction? How do you find those words? What are the words that you would ideally like to have but don't have? Otherwise to convey the gravity of whatever's happening in the background, not just in terms of violence, but familial life, intimate life, private and personal life. Just how do you go about that?
I think I could only do it because I tried to do it in my interviews. I listen very much to why there is silence. Is there silence because there is loss? Is there silence because there is longing? Is there silence because there is anger? Or is there silence because there has simply not been a creation of vocabulary? And I think some of these things, the more interviews you do, the more intuitive you become about them, and the more then it determines how much or how little you can push the threshold of your questioning. I based a lot of my fictional characters on things and people that I had interviewed. It's really like I can pinpoint the dialogues that real interviewees have said that my characters have said as well. Like at some point when Firdaus is finally talking to her grandson about Samir, she says this thing which I've never heard, like this way of using language that I've never heard, where she says, "For 10 years, he mixed with me." And this is a line that one of my interviewees said in Calcutta, where she was talking about the courtship period of her and her husband. And she said, "For many, many days, for weeks, he mixed with me." What she meant to say is that we interacted with one another. We spent time together. But what she said was, he mixed with me. And I felt like that use of amorous vocabulary is so derived from personal experience of one body mixing into another that these are the things you have to look out for. Also, vocabulary of the time. This is clearly a very old person talking about love versus a younger person talking about love. So you have to be respectful of the time that you're writing about. I hope that answers your question.
Can I also add to that, Aanchal? When you said that there are gaps in the language and the silences, and how do you fill those? So, is it also true that we try to fill those silences, particularly in the book, with the language of these art forms? As Madame Pauline says, "खुशबू एक जुबान है," or how they talk about textiles. There's so many things which can't be said, but just by you touching a fabric of velvet, for example, it's going to evoke an emotion. Or smelling a rose, a particular kind of rose, will evoke a different kind of emotion. So I think where vocabulary fails, the arts did go that extra way to lend that sense.
Well, I think also vocabulary is not always verbal. It's not, right? It's as much about what is unsaid. Yeah.
Any more questions?
in historical fiction, who are your favorite writers? Um, Now every title or every word is escaping me. Who am I? No, what was that novel that Orhan Pamuk wrote about objects? The Museum of Innocence. I love that book because it was about objects and the stories they carry and the obsession. Then all the light we cannot see. When this novel was sold, actually, like you have like what is that called, Publishers Weekly Report or whatever. It was like this is in the vein of all the light you cannot see, and it was amazing. But then I read this other novel much later than other people read the novel, which was called More Than I Love My Life, and it was written by the same guy who wrote Horse Walks Into a Bar, that won the Booker. Nobody knows. Never mind. I can't remember either. But More Than I Love My Life is really incredible work of nonfiction. I realized that I gravitate to novels about war. I don't know why.
Right.
But
Yeah, I grew up reading a lot of Bengali literature, and historical fiction was one of the sort of very champion, very popular forms. And
I do think some of the most beautiful works of art to do with partition specifically are Sangeet Natak's films about partition. And I don't think that they are watched by enough people, but they are the most precise and textured and layered.
absolutely. I hope we've covered all the questions. Thank you so much. It's been a very engaging audience. And thank you so much, Aanchal, for the insightful session. Very much.